quick answer, there are slightly different configurations of the actual composting unit itself. But one of the beauties of microbes is that they'll hang in there, so to speak. They're actually pretty robust for themselves. So if you've got a composting system that relies on worms, which I suggest is actually often a good idea, that works best when it's constantly fed and the worms are really active. But the worms will be contained in there and the population will die down as they self-eat all the organic materials there, and they'll come down, and they actually have a cyst or egg form as well. So they'll go into a senescence phase along with the bacteria. So when you next start feeding more fresh material in there, it will pick up again. So the microbes will start growing almost immediately. The worms will take some weeks to re-establish the high numbers, but then they'll start becoming active again. So yes, you can turn these systems off and on biologically. I mean, they're self-regulating in that sense based on what rate you're feeding them. So they are appropriate. If you're going to leave them for over some years, now we're talking about a system that will basically, the bacteria in some form will stay alive, but the numbers will be very much lower and inactive. And so if you're talking about spending years away, no, composting toilets will take a bit more time to get up and rolling, so to speak, back up to full processing speed. But that in itself is not necessarily a problem anyway, because it's going into a large container and that material is building up, and the time it's built up, the microbes have got really active again, and maybe if you've got worms in there, so will they. Or you may need to reintroduce worms depending on how long ago you last used it. So in essence, the composting systems can be used on an ad hoc basis as well as continuous.
Are there examples in this country or elsewhere of smaller rural seaside communities that have embraced any of this at any scale?
What I'm familiar with is, I'm getting the problem now. There are communities, or there are small groups. So Chesapeake Bay, there's just the small sort of Chesapeake Bay research station there where they're looking at some of these alternatives. There are certainly all around the Cape here, as well as various parts of the country, individuals who've done their own thing, and that's, if you like, that's the more common. But whole communities coming together and demonstrating options, I'm not aware of, but there may well be smaller communities, and there's one out in Vermont that we'll hear about, the gentleman down the back there. And there are communities in the sense of, there's a new campus being built out in part of the University of California system out of Riverside there. There's the University of the Desert being put together, and there they're looking at water recycling, energy recycling. So there are some embryonic developments. Some are on the drawing board, some are being constructed. There's another one down, now I'm thinking aloud here, which is a whole dorm community at a university campus, also down in Florida. There's some other demonstrations going on in Tucson, Arizona, near the airport. There's what's called the Water Village. So there are a cluster of little homes, but these are really done as typically university or small-scale research-oriented things, not really done looking at the whole community, as far as I'm aware. But we might go down the back just to follow up on that. Then I will come back to you.
Thank you. I'm Abe Noe-Hayes. I'm from up in Vermont. And there is a development community in Vermont, in Heartland, Vermont, that was built, I guess, over 10 years ago now. And every home in this community had a composting toilet installed. And they've been working very smoothly the whole time. I wish I brought the quote with me. I have it on a paper. One of the residents said that of all of the technologies, because they tried to use a lot of alternative technologies in this development, and they said that the composting toilets were actually their favorite technology. So I know people think about, am I going to like it? Am I going to be able to accept it? They actually found that they really embraced it, and that was their favorite thing.
So which method of composting?
Oh, that was a dry composting. It was a dry toilet, so like Nick showed, but the remote one where it's a pedestal and the composter is down on the floor below.
How many units? How big?
How many units was the question? I would say it was probably around 25 or 30 units, just thinking from memory. I'd have to check.
We also have our own at Zualpini co-housing. And how many houses are there, Helen?
I think how many now have, it was an old farmhouse and didn't have a composting toilet, and they're waiting for this incentive to come up. There are probably 6 right now with composting products, and we all have been extremely happy with it. There's a housing development on the vineyard with 17 of them, and they're all happy with it. They have a service come in twice a year. When you ask the residents, what do you do? And they do put shavings in, but other than that, they don't know what the service does. But it's been there for 11 years. So they must be happy, otherwise they would be screaming.
George, what thing? George Hartfelder, and I'm on the Falmouth Board of Health. Falmouth has got itself in a little bit of a pickle with a number of the watersheds where 100% of the nitrogen is what is necessary to meet what the regulatory officials, the TMDL. And seeing your presentation and understanding that the Blackwater piece is not easy, but relatively easy, leaves a large amount of the water used in the house. The gray water is still there, with uncertain removal of nitrogen within that watershed. So it's like 100% has to go. So how would you suggest that we navigate the channels on the way to sort of sustainability, all of those things which are really laudable things to head toward? How do we navigate toward that, knowing that 100% of the nitrogen in a particular watershed is the only answer we can come back to with the regulatory officials?
So when you talk about 100%, it's an interesting thing to contemplate. So if we start with an existing sort of option, so we know existing sewers leak, and so even if the sewage treatment facility could work at 100% removal, which they don't and are not designed to do at the moment, but they could, there's still leakage through the network to that sewage treatment plant. So to me that means, well, a traditional sewer can't be the answer either. Yeah, and if it was fully vacuumed, yes, and then we've got the same issue. Where might we capture that nitrogen? So taking all the wastewater, we'll call that sewerage from a house, through a vacuum or pressure sewer, which is less likely to leak, I fully agree, and this comes back to a question of scale. Is it one facility or several? They could be quite scattered around the community. These energy, potentially, depending on how much you've diluted it, or how many people you're getting it from, you could treat that and capture the nitrogen and then export that out of the watershed. So that's clearly an option to be thought about. And to compare those suite of options around exporting all the nitrogen in a whole wastewater system, then you can start saying, well, let's look at just black water and grey water. So you could then thin down and have a smaller vacuum or pressure sewer potentially for black water only, and dealing with the same issue, exporting that out of the watershed. And that leaves you with the grey water, which is coming to what your question was about. We don't know exactly what the concentration of nitrogen might be in this particular watershed in the grey water if people were to split the grey and the black. But let's say it's somewhere between 10 and maximum, 20%, somewhere in that range. Could be a lot less, particularly depending on the sorts of products and things that they're using in the home that goes into contributing to that grey water. But that grey water at that level can be treated on site through various sorts of technologies. At the moment, those technologies are normally around filtration, so you get some loss, but not 100% loss of that nitrogen through nitrification and denitrification. So through biological processing, can turn that back into atmospheric nitrogen, but again, it won't be complete. And then you ask the question, well, where is that water being used? If you use that water back in the house, so for clothes washing, toilet flushing, then you're keeping it in that loop, you're not releasing it. But if you want to use some in the garden, that still may be okay if it's going to the garden during summertime where you're irrigating to the degree you're not totally saturating and letting whatever small residual then is in that fraction that goes into the garden. After it goes to the soil, it usually gets trapped in that first few inches, which is the biologically active part of the soil, the most active part. So unless you're saturating the soil so it's seeping all the way down and getting nitrates penetrating down, to me, people putting fertiliser in their garden would be far more important to control. That would be a much greater contributor than you would have from the grey water going in. So I would have thought grey water that's reused in the home with a small or summertime use in the garden, applied around fruit trees and other things that will be taking up that nitrogen along with other nutrients, that would contain it, and the problem would be individuals' use of fertiliser. That to me would be the wild card in that scenario. So when we look at the whole system, I think the wastewater management is the easy bit. The hard bit would be managing people's fertiliser use. So I think that's part of my answer. But
If I could follow up. I think my question's more toward navigating the channels from the information you gave. Okay, I take my grey water, it's down to say 5 milligrams per liter, I produce 200 or 300 gallons, and I use it in my yard. Well, presently, that wouldn't be credited because we're depositing it back in the watershed, and there's really no regulatory now, present regulatory way for us to get credit for any removal as it goes through the ground as we're using it. So I think what I'm asking about is, does EPA offer the state regulatory authorities any sort of guidance, help, whatever, to start getting them to think of how to credit some of these? Because it all comes down to that. It's a number. They say, remove 100%, this is what we say. They make certain assumptions. Here's what your wastewater is, here's the concentration, here's your load per person. And they have presently, they give some credits for when groundwater passes through a wetland. They give some credits for fertilizing lawns, how much really penetrates. They use literature values for that. But as a whole, they don't for some of these more creative approaches, separating gray and black water, using black water on the property, gray water on the property, don't give that. So does EPA, are they actively involved with the state agencies which are regulating the TMDL sort of strategy, structure, to assist them in some of the more creative approaches that your office is proposing?
so in some ways you're asking what are the steps involved. In the Office of Research and Development, we're developing the tools and information that go into the regulatory side of the EPA that then can change at the federal level, and then that goes out to our regional offices, in this case Region 1 for this part of the country, at the federal level of EPA, and then they need to be obviously negotiated with the state, or the states, depending on in Rhode Island or Massachusetts around here, with their local EPAs that actually do the controlling side. And so there are various steps along the way. So to answer your question, the work I'm involved with is helping build up the framework, the understanding, and one of the other reasons why I'd like to work with this community amongst others is so we can actually help you measure and get a sense of what those numbers are under your operating conditions here. It's not very satisfying, my answer perhaps to you, because there are various steps along the way and we haven't got all the way along that path yet to give you the answer you want, other than yes, EPA is working towards, and in the Office of Research and Development, supplying better information so these alternatives can be appropriately considered and fitted into. And I guess the best example, to perhaps answer your question, where it is happening, and there are some consent decrees that have recently been signed off by EPA in Region 5 for the City of Cleveland, the City of Cincinnati, and Pittsburgh. And these allow green infrastructure to help get around some of the TMDL failures that they currently are facing. And it's an adaptive approach. So EPA has signed off on these consent decrees to allow adaptive management. So that probably is your answer, that you need something like that to be allowed in the respective states here to allow these demonstrations and learning from it. And I guess that's the best I can give.
Nick, we have a question